Let me now be just a little bit self-indulgent. As a political interviewer myself, I was always going to like the idea of a television drama about political interviews. And I was particularly going to like it if it was based on a book by the first editor of this LBC show, Rob Burley. The programme, Brian and Maggie, focuses on the 1989 interview carried out with Margaret Thatcher as she was losing her grip on power by the great television journalist and her great friend, Brian Walden. It harks back to an age when TV interviews could really matter, could really change things, and when politicians appear to have been readier to be frank in public than they are today. Let's hear now from Steve Coogan, who plays Brian Walden. In many ways, you might say the absolute antidote or opposite to Alan Partridge. Was he the kind of person that would have struggled to get onto our television screens today?
I think what he brought to the sort of political interrogative is a kind of, not just a probity and a sort of a tenacity in interviewing his subjects, but the use of colloquialisms and very everyday common or garden language that would have been missing from certainly a lot of the sort of BBC stalwarts of the day, like Robin Day and the Dimblebys. And so he brought that sort of that grounded vernacular that made politics more accessible, even though it was what now would be seen as quite an esoteric medium to have a 45-minute long examination of your subject.
And in this series, basically, he and Margaret Thatcher recognise each other as outsiders. That's where it starts, isn't it?
Yes, and that's what attracted me to it, rather than the normal discussion of, or the traditional discussion of world views and differing world views of left and right, and now everything in between. You know, what interested me was the idea of her. I mean, I grew up, someone with my family had huge antipathy to Margaret Thatcher, but ironically, probably I was from the same class as her. I'll describe as sort of lower middle class or upper working class, if you want to get into the sort of the niceties of it. Brian Walden probably a little slightly further down the social scale, but nevertheless from quite similar backgrounds. And I too am from that background, and I've frequently felt myself certainly an outsider when I came into this. Yeah. Business, certainly surrounded by all my sort of privately educated Oxbridge pals, who let me join their gang. But you know, it certainly, I think it's interesting that they were attracted to each other, and not ostensibly from the same political background, but definitely they had. There was a kinship there, and because it crosses the normal political divide, he an ex-Labour MP, her sort of the champion of free market economics. It interested me, the idea of that friendship, a sort of, as it were, political love affair, and how that starts, how it grows, and how it ends. You know.
And of course, Walden had started out, or had become a Labour MP. He was on the right of the Labour Party, but he was a Labour man through and through. He had a trade union background and all the rest of it. But coming to today, in a way, a great suspicion of what we would now call kind of metropolitan or elite liberalism. You know, he didn't like the condescension of London, basically.
No, and I totally agree with that. He would be what some people might call blue Labour. Certainly, I was brought up in that tradition. I came from a sort of socially conservative, but very much a traditional sort of that sort of Judeo-Christian Labour supporter, if you like. And quite traditional in some respects, but definitely on the side of the poor or people outside the establishment, certainly. So the fact that Margaret Thatcher was ironically ended up being one of the most effective agents of the establishment, although she was a disruptor in her own way. Ultimately, I think she helped reinforce the very establishment that she had antipathy for.
I'm interested also in seems to be one of the truths about political journalism, which is that in order to understand what's going on, you have to get relatively close to politicians. And this shows that Brian Walden got far too close, frankly, to Margaret Thatcher for a long time. But then, if you're a proper journalist, you have to betray them.
Indeed, that's what he did. He was faced with a choice. I'm sure there are those situations where you think, well, your journalistic duty conflicts with your affection for your subject, if you like. And that was certainly the case with Brian Walden, and I think he was rattled. He was enamoured with her. I think because she was a disruptor. Apart from her politics, I think that he found interesting. But I don't think he was a huge champion of free market economics by any stretch. But I do think he was interested as an outsider and a disruptor, and I think that but ultimately that relationship grew. He did cross a line as a journalistic line by helping her write speeches because he was enamoured with it.
It was emotional as well, wasn't it? There's a slight sort of almost sexual frisson between the two, and when she sort of cuts him off after that interview, never speaks to him again, it's a bit like the end of an affair.
Absolutely, completely right there, and it had all the hallmarks of that. It didn't really. James Graham, brilliant political writer though he is, didn't have to embellish that. The story sort of presented itself to Rob Burley, who I know you'll know.
Used to edit this programme on which we are talking, of course.
Indeed, yes. And Rob came to me with wrote a book about the history of the political interview, and this story jumped out at him. He brought it to me and said, I think you should play Brian Walden. And I said, I agree with you.
I mean, to be clear, you don't really look much like Brian Walden. He was a heavier man, had a bit of a stoop. But on the other hand, Margaret Thatcher in this doesn't look much like... Harriet Walter doesn't look much like Margaret Thatcher either, and it doesn't somehow seem to matter.
No, I think in some ways it liberates you from having to just do some sort of rendition or, impersonation or facsimile when you try to get under the skin of the person you're playing. I certainly think that Harriet Walter got under the skin of Margaret Thatcher and illuminated her in a way that sort of transcended all those cliches that we have of her. And I like to think that, Brian I certainly identified with, certainly sort of sleeves rolled up, meat and potatoes approach to that sort of political.
Let me ask you about the other aspect of this, because it takes two to tango. It takes an interviewer, but it also takes a politician who is prepared to answer a direct and clear question relatively frankly. And we now seem to be living in an age since then of an awful lot of verbiage going nowhere in particular. The age when Margaret Thatcher would be asked a clear question, would think about it and then give you an honest answer already seems like a distant age.
Well, funnily enough, as someone who at the time had great feelings of antagonism towards that, looking back now through the lens of history, you think, well, whatever her politics, with which of course I disagreed with, and the undoubted legacy of her politics, and I would say in some ways the failure of them, she didn't create a shareholding society, and trickle-down economics didn't trickle down all the way, etc., etc. However, she did know her stuff, and she did not evade those questions. And furthermore, I think there's a lesson for people like Keir Starmer in this. She wasn't afraid of being disliked by adopting a clear position.
You mentioned Keir Starmer just now, Steve. What's your verdict so far on how it's going?
Well, I'm a Labour supporter, but I do despair of the risk-free, be all things to all men approach of Keir Starmer, which I think is a fool's errand and might work in the short term, but eventually bites you on the bum further down the line. And I think that it's like a loss adjuster deciding what policy what your policy view should be, because it's the least worst, lowest risk decision that seems to govern what he says. And no doubt he's a decent man, but I think you sometimes you have to. You have to not try and please all the people all the time, and accept the fact that sometimes people respect you more when you draw a line in the sand, even if they don't agree with you.
And speaking of lines in the sand, finally, Steve, Harry has taken the money, and his case against the Murdoch press has now, as it were, left court. You were involved in all of this. Do you think that now draws a line under the entire phone hacking scandal? Is it all over?
No, it's not. It's the end of the beginning, or the beginning. It's the beginning of the end, but it's not all over because, of course, Harry did not want to settle. He had to settle because you're sort of a Hobson's choice. You either take the money or you risk not only not getting the money but having to pay out probably more than double, because if what's awarded you eventually in court is more than what you. I'll get this right way around. If what you're offered is by the court, judges that you deserve is less than what you were offered earlier, then you become liable for the costs on both sides, and it becomes absolutely crippling, even for someone like Prince Harry, believe it or not. I mean, you end up with a bill for like 25 million instead of being awarded 10, and that's a very big difference. The same happened to me, happened to Hugh Grant, happened to Sienna Miller, that we had to settle. I wanted to go to court. With Mirror Group newspapers, and they just kept coming back offering me more money whilst admitting nothing. And at a certain point, even if you want to, you can't. But there's a dossier and a huge amount of evidence now that we think hacked off. The police need to act upon the clear evidence of perjury, clear evidence of criminality, by senior executives. If they were in any other industry, they would be out on their ear by now. But because they're part of this media circus we live in, then people tend to turn a blind eye to it. So I think that if the police don't act, then there will inevitably be private prosecutions. I'm sure of that.